Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. The attic creaked under his feet as he climbed the rickety ladder. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight, swirling through the musty air. He'd always been curious about what secrets lurked in the shadowy corners of his childhood home, but today Mark was on a mission. His father had asked him to dig out some old tax documents, swearing they were stashed in a box somewhere among the clutter. As he rummaged through stacks of weathered cardboard, a glint of sequins caught his eye. Pushing aside a tattered afghan, Mark uncovered an unfamiliar suitcase. The clasps were tarnished but intact. His brow furrowed as he popped them open, lifting the lid. A cascade of shimmering fabric spilled out. Silky dresses in vibrant hues, delicate lingerie trimmed with lace, and a rainbow array of wigs tumbled across the floorboards. Mark's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled, struggling to process the discovery. This couldn't possibly belong to his father. The stoic, traditional man who'd raised him would never. And yet, as Mark gingerly lifted a sequined cocktail dress, a faded photograph fluttered to the ground. He picked it up with trembling fingers. There, grinning at the camera, was his father. But not as Mark had ever seen him before. Draped in an elegant evening gown, blonde wig framing his face, makeup artfully applied. He looked radiant, happy, free. Mark sank to his knees, overcome by a whirlwind of emotions. Shock gave way to understanding, then a profound sense of connection. Because Mark had a secret of his own, one he'd been terrified to share. Since puberty, he'd felt an inexplicable urge to explore femininity. In the privacy of his college dorm, he'd experimented with makeup and clothing, reveling in the way it made him feel. But shame and fear had always held him back from fully embracing that part of himself. Now, staring at the evidence of his father's hidden passion, Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't alone. The very person he'd been most afraid to disappoint might understand him better than anyone. Taking a deep breath, Mark carefully repacked the suitcase. He'd confront his father, but not yet. First, he needed time to gather his courage and decide how to broach the subject. Days passed in a fog of anticipation and nerves. Mark found himself studying his father with new eyes, searching for hints of the person in that photograph. How had he never noticed the grace in his movements, the softness beneath his gruff exterior? Finally, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Mark steeled himself for the conversation. He found his father in the garage, tinkering with an old radio. "Dad, can we talk?" His father glanced up, a smudge of grease on his cheek. "Sure, son. What's on your mind?" Mark's palms were sweating. He wiped them on his jeans, heart pounding. I found something in the attic when I was looking for those tax papers." A flicker of understanding, then worry, crossed his father's face. He set down his tools, giving Mark his full attention. "I saw the suitcase," Mark continued, "and the picture." His father's shoulders slumped. He looked away, shame etched in the lines of his face. "Mark, I can explain." "You don't have to," Mark interrupted. He took a deep breath. "Because I understand, more than you know." Confusion replaced the guilt in his father's eyes. Mark forced himself to continue. "I've been experimenting, too, with makeup and clothes. It feels right, somehow. Like I'm finally being true to myself." The garage fell silent. Mark held his breath, terrified of his father's reaction. But when their eyes met, he saw only love and acceptance. "Oh, Mark." His father's voice was thick with emotion. He stood, pulling his son into a fierce embrace. "I never wanted you to feel like you had to hide who you are. I'm so sorry." They clung to each other, years of unspoken fears and secrets dissolving in that moment of connection. When they finally stepped apart, both had tears in their eyes. "Tell me everything," his father said. "I want to know who you really are." And so Mark did. He shared his journey of self-discovery, the thrill and terror of trying on his first dress, the way makeup allowed him to see himself clearly for the first time. His father listened with rapt attention, nodding in understanding. When Mark finished, his father squeezed his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son. It takes courage to be true to yourself." "What about you?" Mark asked. "How long have you—" His father sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Since I was about your age, but I never had the guts to be open about it. Your grandfather, well, let's just say he wouldn't have understood." They spent hours talking, swapping stories and experiences. Mark felt a new closeness with his father, a bond forged in shared understanding. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garage floor, his father cleared his throat. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said. "Someone who's become very important to me." Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh?" His father nodded. "Her name is Evelyn. We've been seeing each other for a few months now. She knows about this side of me, and she accepts it completely." A slow smile spread across Mark's face. "That's wonderful, Dad. I'm happy for you." "I think you two will get along great," his father continued. "In fact, why don't you come to dinner with us tomorrow night? I'd love for you to meet her." Mark agreed eagerly. As they headed back into the house, a lightness filled his chest. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen and understood. The next evening, Mark found himself nervously adjusting his collar as they waited for Evelyn to arrive. His father had opted for a smart blazer and slacks, but Mark could see the hint of lace peeking out from his shirt cuff, a small act of authenticity that warmed his heart. The doorbell chimed, and Mark's father practically bounded to answer it. When he returned, he was hand in hand with a striking woman in her early 50s. Her silver-streaked hair was elegantly swept up, and her eyes crinkled warmly as she smiled at Mark. "You must be Mark," she said, extending her hand. "I've heard so much about you." As they settled in for dinner, conversation flowed easily. Evelyn was witty and kind, drawing Mark out of his shell with gentle questions about his interests and aspirations. He found himself relaxing, charmed by her genuine interest and the way she clearly adored his father. Over dessert, Evelyn set down her fork and fixed Mark with a thoughtful look. "Your father tells me you two had quite the heart-to-heart recently." Mark shot a questioning glance at his father, who nodded encouragingly. "It's all right," Evelyn continued. "I know all about your father's, proclivities, and I think it's wonderful that you two can be open with each other." She reached across the table, squeezing Mark's hand. "I want you to know that you have my full support as well. Whatever path you choose to explore, you'll find no judgment here." Touched by her acceptance, Mark felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Thank you," he managed. "That means a lot." Evelyn smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. "In fact, I have a bit of a confession to make. You're not the only one in this situation." Mark's brow furrowed in confusion. His father leaned forward, equally puzzled. "My son, Daniel," Evelyn explained. "He's transgender. He transitioned a few years ago, and he's the happiest I've ever seen him." The revelation hung in the air for a moment. Then Mark's father burst out laughing, not mockingly, but with pure joy. "Well, I'll be damned," he chuckled. "Looks like we've found ourselves quite the understanding little family, haven't we?" As the evening wore on, Mark felt a sense of belonging he'd never experienced before. Here were people who not only accepted him, but truly understood the complexities of gender and identity. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he could fully embrace all aspects of himself. In the weeks that followed, Mark's relationship with his father blossomed. They began to explore their shared interest together, swapping makeup tips and raiding each other's closets. Mark marveled at the transformation in his father, the way his eyes lit up when he slipped on a pair of heels, the confidence that radiated from him in a perfectly tailored dress. One lazy Saturday afternoon found them sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by a sea of nail polish bottles. Mark's father, or Diane, as he preferred to be called when presenting femininely, was painstakingly applying a coat of shimmering purple to Mark's toes. "You know," Diane mused, "I never thought I'd get to experience this. Doing my child's nails, sharing clothes and makeup tips. I always figured I'd have to keep this part of myself hidden forever." Mark wiggled his toes, admiring the color. "I'm glad you don't have to hide anymore. You seem so much happier now." Diane smiled, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "I just wish I'd had the courage to be honest sooner. Maybe things would have been different with your mother." Mark's chest tightened at the mention of his mother, who'd left when he was just a child. He'd always assumed it was because of his father's workaholic tendencies, but now he wondered if there had been more to the story. "Do you think she knew?" he asked softly. Diane sighed, setting aside the nail polish. "I'm not sure. I tried so hard to keep it hidden, but women have a way of sensing these things sometimes. Maybe on some level she realized I wasn't being fully honest with her." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Diane brightened, reaching for a glittery topcoat. "But that's all in the past," she said firmly. "What matters is that we have each other now, and Evelyn. Speaking of which, she wanted me to invite you to dinner next week. Apparently Daniel is coming to town, and she'd love for you two to meet." Mark's stomach fluttered with a mix of excitement and nerves. He'd never knowingly met another transgender person before. The thought of connecting with someone who truly understood his journey was both thrilling and intimidating. "I'd like that," he said. Maybe I could come as Melissa." It was the first time he'd spoken the name aloud to anyone else. Melissa, the name he'd whispered to himself in the mirror, trying it on like a new outfit. Diane beamed, pride shining in her eyes. "I think that's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. And I know just the outfit for you to wear." The night of the dinner arrived, and Mark stood nervously before the mirror, hardly recognizing the person staring back at him. Diane had helped him select a flattering wrap dress in a deep emerald that complemented his skin tone. His wig, borrowed from Diane's impressive collection, fell in soft waves around his face, and subtle makeup enhanced his features. But it was more than just the external transformation that took his breath away. For the first time, he felt like his outward appearance matched the person he'd always known himself to be inside. Diane appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a flowing maxi dress and statement necklace. "You look beautiful, Melissa," she said softly. "Are you ready?" Melissa nodded, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. "As I'll ever be." They arrived at Evelyn's charming craftsman-style home, greeted by the warm aroma of garlic and herbs. Evelyn answered the door with a radiant smile, kissing Diane on the cheek before turning to Melissa. "You look lovely, dear," she said warmly. Come in. Daniel's just helping me finish up in the kitchen." As they entered the living room, a young man emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was handsome in a boyish way, with tousled brown hair and an easy smile. If Evelyn hadn't told them, Melissa never would have guessed he was transgender. "You must be Melissa," Daniel said, extending his hand. "Mom's told me all about you. It's great to finally meet you." Melissa shook his hand, struck by the strength of his grip and the confidence in his bearing. "It's nice to meet you too," she managed, her voice higher and softer than usual. As they settled in for dinner, the initial awkwardness melted away. Daniel regaled them with stories from his job as a wildlife photographer, his eyes sparkling with passion as he described close encounters with bears and the thrill of capturing the perfect shot. Melissa found herself hanging on his every word, envious of the ease with which he inhabited his identity. Halfway through the meal, she worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. "Daniel," she began hesitantly, "if you don't mind me asking, how did you know? That you were transgender, I mean." Daniel set down his fork, considering the question. "It wasn't any one moment," he said thoughtfully. "More like 1,000 little moments that all added up. The discomfort I felt in my own skin, the way I'd always gravitated towards boy things as a kid. But I think the real turning point was when I learned that being transgender was even a possibility. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. He smiled at Melissa, his expression kind. Everyone's journey is different, though. There's no one right way to be trans, you know? Melissa nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She'd been so worried about whether she was trans enough, whether her experiences matched up with what she'd read online. Hearing Daniel's perspective was reassuring. As the evening progressed, Melissa found herself opening up more and more. She shared her fears and doubts, her excitement and hope for the future. Daniel listened attentively, offering advice and encouragement. The most important thing, he said, is to be true to yourself. Don't let anyone else dictate your journey or your timeline. You'll know when you're ready to take the next step, whatever that may be. By the time dessert was served, Melissa felt a sense of kinship with Daniel she'd never experienced before. Here was someone who truly understood the complexities of gender identity, who had walked a similar path and come out stronger on the other side. As they said their goodbyes, Daniel pulled Melissa into a warm hug. "Don't be a stranger," he said. "If you ever need to talk or have questions, I'm just a phone call away." On the drive home, Melissa's mind whirled with possibilities. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly consider a future where she lived full-time as a woman. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. "You're awfully quiet," Diane observed, glancing over from the driver's seat. "Everything okay?" Melissa nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Just thinking, I think I might want to start hormone therapy. To transition, I mean." Diane reached over, squeezing her hand. "If that's what you want, I'll support you every step of the way. We can start researching doctors tomorrow." Tears pricked at Melissa's eyes, overwhelmed by the love and acceptance she felt. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." The next few months were a whirlwind of change. Melissa began seeing a gender therapist, started hormone replacement therapy, and slowly began coming out to trusted friends and family members. To her relief, most were supportive, and those who weren't quickly found themselves cut out of her life. Diane was there for every milestone, beaming with pride as Melissa's body began to align with her true self. They went shopping for new wardrobes together, giggling like schoolgirls as they tried on outrageous outfits and experimented with different styles. As Melissa's confidence grew, so did Diane's. She began venturing out in public presenting as female, first just to LGBTQ-friendly spaces, then gradually to everyday places like the grocery store or a post office. The joy it brought her was palpable. One sunny afternoon, as they strolled through the park hand in hand, Diane turned to Melissa with a mischievous glint in her eye. "I've been thinking," she said. "What would you say if I asked Evelyn to marry me?" Melissa squealed with delight, throwing her arms around Diane. "Oh my God, Dad, that's amazing! Of course you should ask her!" Diane laughed, returning the embrace. "I'm glad you approve. I was thinking of doing it at Pride next month. Will you help me plan something special?" Pride. The thought sent a thrill of excitement through Melissa. It would be her first time attending as her true self. She nodded eagerly, already envisioning the perfect proposal. The day of Pride dawned bright and clear. Melissa stood before the mirror, admiring her reflection. She'd chosen a flowy sundress in the colors of the transgender flag, paired with comfortable sandals for walking. Her hair, now grown out to her shoulders, was adorned with a flower crown. Diane appeared beside her, resplendent in a rainbow-sequined cocktail dress and towering heels. "Ready to go, sweetheart?" Melissa nodded, her stomach fluttering with a mix of nerves and excitement. "Let's do this." The streets were a riot of color and sound. Everywhere Melissa looked, she saw people celebrating their authentic selves. Drag queens in towering wigs, leather-clad bikers, families with children waving tiny rainbow flags, all coming together in a joyous celebration of love and acceptance. As they made their way through the crowd, Melissa felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Daniel grinning at her, decked out in a trans pride tank top and glitter-covered cheeks. "Melissa!" he exclaimed, pulling her into a hug. "You look amazing. How are you feeling?" She returned the embrace, her heart swelling with happiness. "Incredible," she replied. "I've never felt so free." They chatted for a few minutes, Daniel introducing her to some of his friends from the local trans support group. Melissa made mental notes to look into joining. It would be nice to have a community of people who understood her experiences. As the afternoon wore on, Diane began to fidget nervously. Melissa knew it was almost time for the big moment. They made their way to a small stage set up near the center of the festivities, where Evelyn was helping to coordinate the day's speakers. Diane took a deep breath, straightening her dress. "Wish me luck," she whispered to Melissa. "You've got this, Dad," Melissa replied, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. As Evelyn finished introducing the next speaker, Diane strode purposefully onto the stage. She tapped the microphone, drawing the crowd's attention. "Excuse me, everyone," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment." The crowd fell silent, curious. Evelyn turned, confusion written across her face. "Evelyn," Diane continued, her voice growing stronger. "You've brought so much joy and acceptance into my life. You've loved me for exactly who I am and helped me find the courage to live authentically." She dropped to one knee, producing a small velvet box from her clutch. Gasps and excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Will you marry me, all of me, exactly as I am?" Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she nodded emphatically. "Yes!" she cried. "1,000 times yes!" The crowd erupted in cheers as Diane slipped the ring onto Evelyn's finger. They embraced, laughing and crying as confetti rained down from somewhere above. Melissa wiped away her own tears, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. As she watched her father, radiant with joy and finally truly herself, she knew that everything was going to be okay. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.